So, John, thank you for doing this.
Hi, everybody. So I have a fairly easy job to introduce this particular group of speakers. I think everybody in the room knows them all. To my immediate left is Mark Graysinger. We know Mark. To his left is Beth Diamond, who, one thing I have noticed, the people on this panel tend to stay the same, but their titles get cooler and bigger every year. So Beth is now Global Head of Specialty Complex Claims, so that's kind of cool. Chris Novak, to the left, is in charge of the forensic teams for Verizon, which is a small company. You guys may be familiar with them. But he's going to talk a little bit about their study today. To his left is Toby Merrill, also new cool title. I'm going to make this one up, but I think I have the gist of it right. Worldwide Chief of Cyber for ACE. So he's got that going. And Jeremy, who the first time he spoke at one of these was a mere claims guy. Now he's in charge of all U.S. specialty cyber claims for XL. So we've got a pretty strong panel here. I'm going to kick it off because we are a little behind the 8 ball. Mark, why don't you walk us through your data for the year, but in particular, tell us how you gather it.
Okay. Tom, if you guys can pull up the claim slides, please. Is this on?
We're having an issue with the slides today, apparently.
Slides, claim slides, please.
Not the video, Tom, the slides.
And as he's teeing us up, everybody, this is our 5th year of doing a claim study. And thank you to all the insurance folks in the audience who contribute data to us each year, claims for actual breaches that were paid out by many of the carriers in this room. I think we collected from maybe 20, 25 carriers, and we got about 160 claims. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to trend this data to educate your risk manager clients as to how real this problem is. To the many points that Shane raised today, there's things in the paper that you read about, but it's also a lot of the Main Street events that a lot of the brokers and underwriters in this room see day in and day out. John's team alone, as a breach coach, sees one data breach event per day. He's got 15 lawyers doing nothing but this kind of stuff. So thank you to, again, the claims folks, the underwriters in this room who give us this data so we can do these kind of educational studies. Real quick, I just have a few slides to give you an overview of our study. You can download this report right from our Net Diligence website. There's a more detailed version of this inside your eRisk Hub if you have the eRisk Hub. But the average cost for a data breach event is $674,000. A lot of the 160 claims, though, that skews to the smaller businesses, smaller to medium-sized business. To them, that's a lot of money. If you're a large company, your average claim is $4.8 million. If you're in the healthcare sector, your average claim is $1.3 million. So you see a little bit up there about medians and typicals and range for some of our actuary friends who, when you put these reports out, you get about 3 emails a day from an actuary. So we're going to start fielding those shortly. Average records per cost. So this is always tricky because whenever you use the word average, it skews the meaning of it to some people. $964 per record. What was interesting to me is if you can see in the little graphic to the right, it's very close to what it was last year. I think a lot of this cost is being driven, especially in the healthcare sector. We see very small entities with very few records having significant cost to investigate, have legal counsel, do some kind of notification, and that tends to drive up the average per record cost. But if, again, look at the median, and it's in the $13 range. Now, I also want to caveat that if you're a large company, we've seen some multi-million-dollar record breaches, it could be pennies on a record at that point. So it's, again, it's just, this is where the numbers come down. Crisis service costs were the thing obviously caught up in majority of events. There's not always lawsuits involved. In fact, that might be 10% of the time. But there was always crisis service costs, first-party costs being paid out. The average crisis service cost for data breach came in at about $500,000. The median, $60,000. The legal cost to John and his brethren in the room, who are the defense lawyers and breach coach lawyers, that significantly jumped this year. Legal settlement defense costs $434,000, and the legal settlement about $880,000. And again, we have a little bit of historic chart there to the right for the past 5 years. Skip this. This was just a summary of all the events the past few years. Again, you have a PowerPoint in your app that shows this if you have the Session app today. The data type caught up in most of the claims, no surprises, PII, PHI, PCI type data. Causes of loss, if you remember a few years ago, every time we did these kind of studies, it was consistently lost laptops. Lost laptops seems to be definitely falling back the last few years because there's better policies and procedures out there. Policyholders are being told they can't bring a laptop in the field, or if you have a laptop, it can't have 1 million records on it, and if it does, it needs to have whole disk encryption. That training or education seems to be getting out there. Hackers is sort of the top of the chart here as far as causing the loss, followed by malware. Health, again, business sectors here, no real surprises. It's healthcare, financial services, retail. But a healthy mix of all the business sectors. We were seeing claims from, you name the sector, they were coming in, so that was interesting. And this is just the makeup of the size of organizations that were getting these kind of claims. Small, micro, medium size, definitely making up the great majority of the slice of pie here. Again, I wanted to thank, I mentioned early on, this is crucially important, all the carriers in this room who contributed to this study, giving us their claims, very appreciate it, and especially I want to thank our sponsors who help us defray the cost of putting on this study, which takes about a half year. Patrick Flores in the room, who does a great job crunching the numbers for us. Sharon Lyon and her team help write the report, so we have a lot of people involved, and the sponsors help us contribute to defray the cost, so thank you to the sponsors. And we're going to be reusing some of this claims data in the back end of ERA's Cub, this Q1 coming up with a new tool to give access to your risk managers to show them sanitized claims events per whatever sector or size they are. So that's coming, just look for that. And thank you. Again, the study's out there on our website. Please download it. If you have any questions, we're around all day. Thanks, John.
Chris, I'm going to kick it to you, and you can walk through some of your statistics and perhaps any differences that you can note between your study and your numbers and Mark's would be.
Hey, Jerry, if you can pull up Chris Novak's slides, please. And if you haven't read the Verizon report, Verizon does a great study every year, the DBIR report. They were kind enough to give us a summary that we inserted in the net diligence study. That's in there, coming from the Verizon team. Chris leads their forensic practice. We've known him for years. He works with a lot of the carriers in this room, and he's just going to give you a summary of what the Verizon DBIR guys found.
There you go.
Thanks. So the report is something that we've been working on, as Mark mentioned, for a number of years now. It's actually a study based on, as you see there, data from 70 contributing organizations. So when we first started putting the report together, it was just based on data that we had, and to be clear, it's based on investigations that we did in a consulting fashion for other organizations. So thankfully, it's not 70,000 breaches within Verizon, right? So this kind of gives some clarity as to what we're seeing around the industry from a data breach standpoint, and it also means that because there's 70 contributing organizations, it's not really skewed in any one way towards any one organization's data, right? We see some type of investigations, and many of the other contributors see other types of incidents or investigations. At a high level, one thing I want to be clear on, it's not the universe of everything. But what we're trying to do here is get a great sample set of what's happening around the world from the eyes of a lot of different organizations so that we can get good at approximating what that looks like. So you see there it covers 79,000 plus security incidents, 2,100 plus confirmed data breaches. And the difference there is security incident essentially is something that pops up on your radar that, you know, as Shane mentioned earlier, something that is going to cause you to have to do some kind of analytics or investigation to figure out what does it mean? Is it data loss or data leakage? Is it a reportable event? Versus the 2,100 plus data breaches, which are situations where after you've actually gone through and done an investigation, you found out, yes, we lost data, and we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to get legal involved. We're going to have to do further investigation. We're going to have to notify and potentially disclose. So here, I'm not sure how many folks will actually be able to read this kind of eye chart here, but the report is something you can download for free online, and you can get all the details as well. But the idea here of what I wanted to kind of focus on is if you look at that, you see a number of the different industries there highlighted. And for the most part, everything from accommodations to construction to utilities to real estate to retail, everyone's impacted in some way. And we broke it down based on the size of the organization, small being less than 1,000 employees, large being greater than 1,000, just to kind of show some of the differences there between the two. And also you see the number of security incidents versus the number of data breaches. So you see, obviously, some of the biggest contributors to it being things like public sector, right? You see 50,000 plus security incidents on the public sector side, and I think a lot of folks in the room have been very aware of a lot of the breaches that we've seen on the public sector side as well. I'm not going to go into great detail onto all these things, but again, just highlighting that really nobody's immune. For the most part, if you're plugged into anything, there's a risk there, whether it's a utility, telecom, you name it. And I think the interesting thing there you see on the right-hand side, 70% of attacks show a secondary victim. I think it's interesting how often we go in to do an investigation and the victim believes they're the only one. They'll usually come and tell us, oh, we found this in our environment and we believe this is a targeted attack on us. We just haven't figured out why someone wants our XYZ data, whatever it is that's stolen. And oftentimes what we find is when we actually start getting in there and we get into the meat of what actually happened, the majority of the time we find that the tools and the exploits have all been reused. They might be the 30th victim in a chain of organizations that have been hit. In some cases, it could be hundreds. So a lot of times we do find that there's a lot of reuse of their tools and tactics. And you see they're also 75% spread from victim 0 to 1 in less than 24 hours. So usually they're moving through these fast. I didn't include it here, but I usually have a little video that I go through, and it's a video of a breach from about maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And you see, it's kind of really old school where you see the hacker kind of typing out the commands as they're breaking into the organization. And you see them going through and harvesting all the data. And one of the interesting things that I point out there is it's an entertaining video because something's happening on the screen, right? But nowadays, you don't see breaches like that because everything is automated with malware. Back then, someone had to be typing commands to steal the data. And if they took a break, if they went to sleep, the breach essentially stopped for a period of time until they woke up and continued their activities. Now it's all automated. So back then, when a particular threat actor group might be going after a few dozen targets at a time, today we're seeing those same threat actor groups have matured. They're going after easily hundreds, if not thousands, of victim organizations simultaneously. In fact, a lot of times we'll have victims that will ask, hey, we believe we've contained the incident. Do you think that they're going to come back and try to get back in? And interestingly enough, we find a lot of times, unless it's a fully targeted kind of nation-state sponsored kind of activity, the majority of the time they don't come back. And the reason why is they've got so much data coming in from so many other breach victims. If one falls off the map, they don't bother trying to get back in because they've probably brought in hundreds already since then. And I'll move through this quick because there's a lot of data in the report that'll kind of highlight a lot of this as well. But this kind of shows you, this is a stack stream graph of what the incident patterns look like over the years and kind of what has contributed largely to the, let me highlight, the incidents. So these are what pops up that we need to investigate. And you see there in kind of that middle period from 2007 to 2011, the biggest pieces of the incidents were things like point-of-sale intrusions in that kind of maroon-looking color. And then you see it's kind of changed a little bit as time went on to the bigger pieces in the last year or so being your insider misuse and miscellaneous errors that have contributed to the incidents. But when you fast forward and kind of look at what actually happened from a data breach perspective in the last couple of years, where the data is actually being stolen, what's becoming reportable incidents, the big pieces are still things like point of sale, cyber espionage, a lot of your intellectual property theft, things along those lines. Insider misuse, still significant. Another thing I think that's also interesting is how much of these breaches rely on old data. You look at the top graph there, 7 million vulnerabilities exploited in just the last year. But I think if you look at when those vulnerabilities were discovered, you see those bar charts, they show you last year, these were all of the different things that were exploited, but look at when that vulnerability was first discovered and made known. You see there, 2007, there were over 90 vulnerabilities that were discovered in 2007 that were used to breach organizations just last year. There was over 30 from 1999 that were used to successfully exploit organizations last year. And I think that's interesting because a lot of organizations will say, well, it's just a patching problem. People need to patch faster. Do you mean to tell me that there are people out there who are not patching every 10 years? Exactly, right?
Chris, real quick, what I find, the bottom statistic here, 10 CVEs account for 97% of all these exploits. If you go to the CVE list, which is published, there's hundreds and hundreds of CVEs. 10 of them, if you knock those 10 out, you knock out the great amount of
Why don't you
risk.
tell us what a CVE is so the room knows?
Sure. So the CVE is essentially just an identifier of a particular vulnerability. So if you go out, you can Google for the specific CVE, and it'll tell you it is a buffer overflow error or something like that. Usually when a vendor identifies a problem, it's labeled with a CVE number, and then it can be tracked in terms of what the vulnerability is, and then how someone can go ahead and fix it. So the fact that these were identified for 5, 10 plus years, there's a lot of information out there. And usually what it comes down to is organizations don't have a good understanding of what assets they have, where they have them, and how they address them. And so these things are just sitting out there running for years and years on end with nobody looking at them. In fact, I've seen breaches where we go in and we work to try to contain how the breach happened. And we'll say, well, what is that system? What is that system? And they'll say, I have no idea. That system was here from years. It's just been there before I got here. And their solution to try and figure out what that system does is they'll say, shut it down. Shut it down, and we'll see who calls the help desk to say something's not working, because they have no idea. And everybody laughs, but I see this day in and day out, and some of the big ones that you've seen in the media, this is exactly how some of those have played out in the back end. And usually it's because the organizations are so large that it becomes such a monster to try and keep track of all the assets and what they do. So this just kind of highlights what I was talking about before in terms of most of this is happening in a way that you just can't see with the way that the malware is automated. And most of it is just happening extremely quickly. And you see here everything from healthcare records, payment card data, all the things that we've talked about today, and it moves so quickly. And then phishing, there's nobody here that has not received a phishing email lately, has there? It's getting better and better, right? And as Shane mentioned earlier, I think that's one of the critical things. One of the things I always say is where there's not a vulnerable system, there's always a vulnerable person, right? It's the easiest way into most organizations. And as was also mentioned, there's no reason to waste some of your best weaponry when some of the easiest ways in is just saying, hey, hold the door for me. And they just let someone right in. And so we see that phishing is alive and well. And if you look at some of the statistics there at the bottom, you see people are readily and quickly clicking on it. In fact, we do a lot of phishing exercises. And we'll actually let like the CIO or the CSO kick it off. And they'll say, okay, well, we'll come back tomorrow and see if anyone was victim. Before we even leave the room, you'll start to see things popping up on the screen of who already clicked on it and gave up their passwords. And then this is just some further analysis based on some data as it relates to the cost. Because for years and years, we had not even touched what a breach cost. And everyone said, look, we need to know what it costs so we can try to figure out how we wrap this around our initiatives. How do we build support for security? Because it's not fun and exciting for a lot of organizations as much as it is for my team when we get in there looking to do an investigation. And you see there kind of the expected costs down the middle and a lower and upper average, and then a predicted lower and upper. And that's based on about a 95% confidence level. So you see there, you can go from anywhere from, say, $1,000 on the smallest of the low end to almost $200 million on the highest of the high end. And I've seen little breaches play out in really bad ways for organizations, and big breaches that probably nobody in this room has ever heard of. And a lot of it just goes down to how well that organization was prepared and how well they managed it. And I think this is probably the last one that I have here. And this also goes to one of the points that was raised earlier. It has to do with intelligence and information sharing. You look at this is what we call the detection deficit. And you see there the line on the top, the orange line, is how quickly organizations are being compromised in days or less. And you see there, going back to 2004, about 75% of organizations were compromised in days or less. So they broke in, they got access to the data in that amount of time. You see in 2014, we're looking at 90+% breaking in days or less. How quickly is it that the good guys are discovering it? That blue line on the bottom? Not nearly as good, right? We're looking at single-digit percentages going back to 2004, and if we're lucky, about 30% or so in 2014. The upside here is, as you see, it's the smallest deficit on record, but it's still a 45% deficit. And as was mentioned earlier, the majority of these breaches we see going on for hundreds of days before they're even discovered. And then that doesn't even take into consideration how long it takes for an organization to then contain it once they know about it. I think that was probably the last one.
All right, we're good. So let's get in the dirt a little bit. I think it's important to remember, though, we've been talking a lot about the bad guys and hackers, malicious actors. A lot of what Toby and Jeremy and Beth and their organization see, a lot of it is the bad guys, but a lot of it's not. A lot of it's just employee mistakes still, and that's real, and that's a huge proportion of some of this, and vendor mistakes. So yeah, there's a lot of bad guys out there, but there's a lot of people who just make mistakes too. So, and to that end, why don't you three people who really see the dirt of it all, talk to us about where you see the claims coming from, et cetera. Give us some examples. Tell us how it's different. Jeremy, why don't you start?
Sure. I think, to some extent, the claims really reflects what you're selling. So what you're selling is, every company is vulnerable. Every industry is vulnerable. There's more information stored on computers now than at any time in human history. And it's not specific to one industry. And whereas, let's say, Home Depot or Target or Sony or some of these large, corporations are the ones getting all the buzz and maybe driving the industry to some extent, it really is every industry. And in my job, I don't just see the ones that hit the headlines, I see all of them. And I can't, necessarily pin it down, and, I'm sure there's percentages, but I can't pin it down and say this is where we are seeing issues. We're seeing issues with every single type of industry. Just for one example, a lot of claims that are coming in deal with government municipalities. And that is just a perfect example of an entity that's just ripe for breaches because their IT department is not going to be very strong. There's obviously going to be people who have an axe to grind with a governmental entity, and they're just not prepared for something like this. And that's happening more and more often. And then, obviously, we could all talk about retail and healthcare, and we all know about that, in utilities, et cetera. But I think if you just take every type of industry, we're seeing it everywhere. So when you go out there, the brokers and the underwriters, and you say everybody's vulnerable, every industry is vulnerable, it's true because everything, the claims we're seeing really just run through every industry.
Good.
So I don't get my hands dirty. I'm the underwriter, and on the claims panel, by the way. So I'm not sure how that worked out. But good job, Tom. But I think what we're seeing is very similar to what Jeremy's saying. Is that it's not just the big brand breaches that you hear about there. It's when we're insuring this, we're insuring a lot more of the middle market. And I think one of the things that I looked at Mark's survey that kind of just really sort of shot out at me is you're seeing the average claim trend come down. And sort of what is driving that is sort of the question that I had. And so I really thought about it. I was like, well, one, I think a lot of the carriers out there were writing a lot more small businesses, a lot more middle market clients as opposed to just large clients. So what Chris showed on his slide is that this, generally the smaller breaches cost less. There are exceptions to that, right? Mark's study shows that there were 60 million records for a nano company, a company with less than 50 million in revenue, had a 60 million record breach, right? So that there are exceptions to that. But I also think it has a lot to do with, the insurance carriers have done a really good job of developing breach teams with a lot of the vendors in this room. And so working with clients and making sure that they have the appropriate, things to really respond to that breach when it happens, because I think the biggest reason why you see losses hit, and I think Chris commented on it, was that it's not really that a company was breached, it's how they responded to it that really cost them the most money. And then I think the last part is that on the underwriting side, we're emphasizing that. We're out there underwriting to that for companies, so we're asking those questions of the company before we let them have an insurance policy. We're saying, what type of an incident response plan do you have? And then we're trying to get them access to resources to actually implement that before it does occur, so that when the bad day happens, they can mitigate that significantly. I mean, Chris mentioned that, we've seen some really big breaches for clients that we've had where we're sort of sitting back saying, oh boy, we're just get ready to write the limits off. But the reality is that company was very well prepared, brought in the right vendors, had a very aggressive response plan, and in some cases it was a very, very small loss. So I think there's a lot to be said about preparedness.
Yeah, and I think in terms of trends, the breach types haven't really changed over the years. You still see paper breaches. You still see well-intentioned employees causing breaches. There's been so much attention in the media, and rightfully so, on the hackers. And we're certainly seeing that across the board. And you see that across industries and across size of companies. And I think one of the interesting things out of Mark's research is just showing the increase in the cost of these breaches. In our experience, a lot of it is coming from the forensic side. So, where in a typical smaller middle market company, you may not have had as much forensic need on a breach response historically, we're really seeing that ratcheted up and that naturally increases the costs associated with responding to that breach. We absolutely are seeing the same thing, what Chris's statistics are showing in the Verizon report as well. Some of these attacks and some of these invasions into a network really are to get at intellectual property. And those that are trying to get at that intellectual property have become much more sophisticated in their attacks so that they are avoiding the PII databases, the PHI databases. They know that they will set off the alarm bells if they go anywhere near that. So they are actually really ratcheting up their sophistication so that they're staying away from that protected data, the one that sets off all these notification obligations, to go after the intellectual property that they want. And they will be in an insured system. They will be looking for that and trying to exfiltrate that. And we've dealt with insureds having to manage those situations because it's a matter of someone's in your system. You need to communicate outside of your system. You need to find a way to have a cover story about why you're taking your network down so that they don't get spooked and they don't sort of grab and run before you're able to kick them out on your own. And we're also seeing a real trend in cyber extortion claims as well. And you've probably seen that covered in some of the financial media. It's real, and we've started to see it. And the way that these have started to go down, they're not the crypto lockers anymore. These are the ones where a company will face a sort of a 1-hour DDoS attack, right? So they get a DDoS attack, and it gets pulled, and then they get a message that says, pay me 10 Bitcoins in 48 hours, or you're going to face an even larger, more sustained DDoS attack. And so we have seen that trend. We have helped insureds respond to that trend. For the time being, and in the number that we've seen and what I've seen as well reported in the media, all of these extortion demands are very small. They want 5 Bitcoins, they want 10 Bitcoins. Now we've seen one for 20 Bitcoins. I mean, these are not material amounts of money in terms of their actual financial value, but they do cause an insured to have to respond very quickly and figure out how to redirect the network, how to deal with the issues, and to also question, and I think always important in any of these types of situations where you see a more traditional first party like that, whether it's really just a distraction from someone invading your network to get your data. And that's something not to lose sight of. Some of these things are really to get your eye off the ball, where they actually go after the real prize, and this is just merely a distraction. So an interesting thing that I'm watching is, will those 10, 15, 20 Bitcoin demands start to really ratchet up into material financial numbers, and will the dynamic on cyber extortion change?
And John, if I could add one thing, in Chris's study, they did an interesting view of phishing attacks. 1 in 4 employees were clicking on a phishing email relatively quickly. The last couple months, we've seen a bunch of claims coming in from some of our carriers in a room where their CEO or CFO was being impersonated by some bad guy. They're sending a note to their comptroller saying, pay this bill, we owe these people $1 million for whatever it is. They actually did some reconnaissance on the CEO, calling their secretary to find out when they're leaving town, so that person just can't pick up the phone and contact the CEO right away. And these guys wire out millions of dollars, and then they send a note to the CEO saying, we took care of it, and they're all like, what are you talking about? It's the past month we've seen 4 or 5 just come in from multiple carriers. So again, it's a type of phishing email, relatively low-level technology, I would say, Chris, but it's happening over and over again. So.
My own little mini trend is, for the 3rd straight year, we've had a microfiche breach, if you can believe it. It's still out there, and people still lose it. So it does happen. It's amazing. So given that high-tech reference, I will, let's talk a little bit about regulatory, right? About a week ago, I was on a call with 37 different state AGs. One call, all of them on one call, one breach. So obviously, somebody's paying attention, right? So question to you, Jeremy, and then kick it through the whole team here is, what are you seeing from a regulatory point of view? And contrast, if you would, the state versus the feds, who's doing what to who?
So, I mean, I think if you step back and you take a look at why do we even have the regulatory scheme, at its essence, the government's job is to look out for its citizens. And so whether it's that it's something they should be doing out of the goodness of their heart, or it's just simply political and people want to get elected, everybody is getting involved now in terms of, how companies should respond to the regulatory matters. Now, obviously, we still have complete chaos within the nation in terms of different breach laws, in terms of different states. Some AGs are very aggressive, some aren't. And you need someone who has an understanding of how to essentially work with these regulators to try to avoid the fines and penalties. So as everyone, I'm sure here is clear on, the key is to do everything right up front to try to stave off the regulators and make sure there are no fines and penalties. I don't think it's really a strict liability standard whereby if you've been breached, you've definitely done something wrong. It's pretty well known in our society now that no matter what you do, you can still be breached. So I think in terms of the regulators, what they're just looking for is making sure you do have a plan in place. It's a robust plan. It's very important to your company. And that if something does happen, you are immediately on top of it. What you absolutely cannot do is put your head in the sand and assume it's going to go away and just hope it all works out. Now, if a company is breached and immediately they start their forensics investigation and they're notifying the proper entities and they're getting, credit monitoring or identity theft monitoring, not only is that something that can stave off the lawsuits, but it can also stave off the fines and penalties from the regulators. So, how this is going to morph, we don't know. And that's something that's just so fascinating about this industry in general. It's constantly changing. I mean, I think someday it would be clear to everybody that we're going to have to move towards some national law versus the current system we have with 47 out of the 50 states have essentially their own laws, and you have the different regulators, different entities coming after you. But it's something that obviously the insurance industry has responded to. It's something that is covered in the policies. But as long as, from our perspective, everything is done right up front and you work with your insurer and you work with the attorneys and you work with the vendors, the regulators are something that it shouldn't necessarily be so problematic to us.
I agree with Jeremy. I think the biggest trend we're seeing is it's all about consumer protection, and so along those lines, we're seeing I think it's each AG has its button, sort of its opinion on things. So like in Connecticut, you have to have 2 years of credit monitoring. As long as you know that, you're prepared, then you're probably going to be okay. We have the Nevada AG is actually on the flip side. They're actually using consumer protection law to actually try and impose a $9 million demand against one of our insureds. So I mean, you have all sorts of different types of things that pop up depending on, I think Jeremy pointed out, it could be political reasons, or it could be that they're specifically looking to find ways to generate revenue for the jurisdiction. I think on a federal level, you see what happened with FTC in the Wyndham case. You definitely are seeing that there's going to be more enforcement coming at a federal level. I think the FTC is gearing up. I think a lot of folks in this room also have gone to the IAPP. You hear a lot of discussions about how the FTC is going to be taking on additional enforcement action. And then once you go over the pond, you talk about the EU data regulations. So you absolutely are going to see a lot more, not necessarily reactive actions taken by regulators, but becoming more proactive. Things like wrongful collection of data, which is something that's been popping up in Mark's more recent study.
Yeah. In terms of some of the things that we see on the regulatory side, you have regulators who want to be in the space and they want to use it for whatever it may be, whether it's their next election stump or to get funds for their state coffers. But we see them really actively wanting to weigh in on breach response or on things that follow. There's a conversation we had with a California AG representative about why credit monitoring wasn't offered on a breach that was passwords, logons and passwords. And the person just really did not understand what credit monitoring is and what it provides and where one would use logons and passwords. So, there's a lack of sophistication on the part of some of the folks that we see out there, and that does cause them to have expectations that can be a challenge to meet because it's sort of putting a square peg in a round hole. We've had that as well on a breach where the FTC is very happy with all of the security changes an insured has made and all of the steps the insured has agreed to take forward. FTC says, great, we're done, no fine, we're very happy with what you're doing. And over a year later, the AGs step in and say, oh, gee whiz, you've resolved everything, now it's time to pay us, and literally put their hand out and say, if you don't pay us, we're going to sue you, so pay us now.
right.
And by the way, we don't like those security measures you agreed with the FTC. We've come up with our own lists that we think are better. And, again, somebody like Chris with his expertise would be able to tell you very clearly why those are not actually better security measures, but, they've come up with their list and they're looking to try to impose that on an organization. And I think some of the struggles there is you never want somebody to agree to take forward certain security measures that don't give them the latitude to improve their security over time. And that's one of the struggles as well sometimes when you're negotiating with an AG's office is they want something done a certain way. They want to lock in that you'll always do that way. But the reality is that this is a continuum, and you want every organization improving its security, not standing still because of some kind of resolution. One of the other interesting things that we've seen, and it's not really regulatory with the sense of, I think, John, your question, but I just want to touch on it, which is really in the PCI realm. And historically, when you look at the smaller middle market retailers, you didn't see them getting very large assessments. There seemed to have been a certain level of appropriate touch given their size and their financial status, but we've really seen that change in the last calendar year, and those assessments are really starting to ratchet up, even for smaller, more middle-sized retailers, and so that is something that we've seen developing just in this calendar year.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Beth. I think, both, two things that I noticed in Mark's study that were kind of surprising to me. One, on the regulatory fine side, it had the average defense payment at 186 grand versus 750,000 for the settlement. I usually see it inverted. Usually the defense is the much higher number because of the threat type of environment. There's a lot of money being spent on hiring attorneys to help just manage these relationships and manage clients through the regulatory process. And then on PCI, similar thing on the study. I think that the statistics, only 4% of claims actually resulted in a PCI matter with a range of 21,000 to 600,000 in actual dollars. It sounds relatively small compared to, I don't want to downplay it, they're real numbers for small companies, but compared to the dollars that are being disclosed on the study, they're very, very small, which is surprising. But then you look at the flip side, 71% of the records exposed were PCI. So that's a significant number. And 28% of the claims paid. So there's the maximum there is 8.9 million when it's a PCI matter, but it's not necessarily the assessment. It's other damages and other fees that are triggering it. So PCI, I think, is something that anybody who's managing point of sale, particularly now as effective 10/1 going forward, is a real exposure that's out there. And I think both for regulatory and PCI, we're only going to see this trend larger, not it get smaller.
Yeah, my experience with I'm going to come to you, Jeremy. My experience with the regulatory, first of all, the Wyndham case basically said, hey, this doesn't give you free rein to pursue everybody, FTC, which is exactly what it did. So when the judge says that means the opposite. It's like saying clearly when you don't have a really good argument. But what we see in those cases is it's not always about just the breach and how you handled it. It's also what you did for the last 4 years. And that was the earlier comment about policies and procedures. It sounds so boring, but that's what they do. The regulators come in and they want to hear and see how you handled this breach, but then they want to know how seriously you took data and privacy for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's a difficult retrofit when you've basically ignored it and now you're trying to show that you took due diligence steps and you sort of kind of didn't. So that's the tricky part. The other part of it is don't fight with regulators. Fight with plaintiffs' counsel, don't fight with regulators. That's a fight you probably won't win unless you absolutely must go that route. Jeremy?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last thing. In terms of regulators, and it also applies with PCI, and as much as it pains me to plug John Mullen, you have a situation today where, people who are trust and estates lawyers or, handling securities class actions a few years ago has now jumped into the cyber realm. But, as it is with anything, it's who you know. So a lot of times when you're dealing with regulators, for me, from a claims perspective and keeping the cost down for my employer as well as our insured, you want someone who's dealt with these people and who knows them. And you want someone who can call up the AG from Massachusetts and say, hey, it's John Mullen, listen, what do we have here? What's the situation? Versus someone who's never dealt with them before. And I really think the attorney that you retain in terms of dealing with regulators makes a huge difference in terms of the actual payment that's going to go out. And I think it's obviously the same with PCI. I mean, when you're dealing with these large credit card companies or banks, it's going to be, do you know this person? Do you have a familiarity with them? And that's why I think it's imperative to have someone who has been doing this for a long time and not just put out a shingle that says, hi, I do cyber, let's move forward.
Mark, could you hand this 20 to Jeremy? Let's talk briefly about business interruption, right? Because we hear about it, and in theory it's out there, and we know it does happen sometimes. But what are you guys seeing?
You said 50.
I'm a lawyer. What do I tell you? Going to expense it anyway. Don't worry about it. So let's talk about business interruption. What are you guys seeing there? Is it actually happening? Do we actually have those claims? Give me some information on that, where we're going.
What I'm seeing, it seems to be the big buzz in the industry, and from what I can tell, that's what the brokers are pushing and the underwriters are pushing. From a claims perspective, in all honesty, I haven't really seen that many. It's not as many as you'd think there would be. It's also, just from a claims perspective, I think it's difficult to quantify. I mean, there's not an exact science as to how you would make a determination as to what exactly your business interruption is. For example, if the system was down for 1 month in a particular year, you could look at, well, how much business were you doing the previous 12 months? What were you doing the previous 4 years? But there's other factors. Maybe it's who knows? It's the slow season. That type of product isn't doing well. Your company wasn't doing well. It's not an exact science. So when they do come in, and they do come in just not as frequently as we think, you really have to gather as much information as you can. And almost from a claims perspective, we have to do some sort of forensic analysis to really look at the books. Okay, let's see the last few years. What exactly do you have? And you need to show me, how exactly did this breach affect your bottom line? But I'm curious what you guys think. But for me, it hasn't been as many claims as one would think.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
No, go ahead, Beth.
We had a very similar experience with that, which is there's a lot of questions on it. It's always an area of great interest, but actually the number of events we see are far less than the amount of interest in the area. And I think companies have gotten pretty sophisticated at understanding how to redirect their networks to try to shut those down really quickly as well. So, the volume of them is fairly low, and similar to what Jeremy said, they can be a challenge to actually adjust because there's not a perfect method to doing that. There's so many different factors based on the type of organization and their history and what might be going on in their particular space that really has an impact on that. So it has to be very much an open dialogue, I think, in terms of getting to the right area. One thing we have seen, which is a bit different and interesting, we've really seen it abroad, primarily in France, is where people are getting into people's websites, and what they're doing is, as I'll politely call it, graffiti, but they're defacing the website in a way that makes it unacceptable to be up. And so an organization has to sort of really quickly yank it down, get that offensive content off, and then put it back up. And so it's a bit of a spin on what people traditionally think of a BI, because it's not a DDoS in that sense. But we are seeing that in Europe as a trend, is this sort of the defacing of these outward-facing websites and the needs of companies to respond to that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen an increase in ransomware, which is it turns into somewhat of a business interruption claim. It's not as big as a denial of service, but it's still something you have to deal with. We've definitely seen more claims come in, but again, as a percentage of the overall, it's very, very small. The reality too is that only about 25% of our policyholders actually buy the business interruption cover. So we've probably seen an equal amount of clients that have actually not bought and had claims compared to the ones who bought the cover and had claims. And we get the call either way because they call our hotline and they get in. In fact, we had one last week where we referred them to Mark, and Mark got them with the right client to help them manage it. I think it's not that different than data breach, in that you just really want to make sure that you have the appropriate resources ready to address that. So I think the reality is the breach teams that are out there, it's not just going to be about data breach teams. It's going to start to expand further as business interruption does become a bigger issue, because the Internet of Things and everything else, it's going to become a bigger exposure. I think, the carriers, I think, are already starting to develop incident response teams, not just for data breaches, but for those other matters, to make sure that the clients are properly responding.
I mean, it certainly raises the level of stress at the carrier, right? Because you already have some type of intrusion going on. And then the question is, well, what did they get to? We don't know yet if it's PII, PHI, PCI, et cetera, but we know bad guys are in the system. So how do you respond to that? And oh, by the way, the specter of BI is floating out there. And if you don't get it fixed fast, what could be just a breach response situation might well be that plus BI. So it definitely raises the tension level across the board and how you handle
Hey, John,
things.
real quick, to Toby's point about the BI exposure not being the most prominent coverage out there, we, the past year, have been brought in by some brokers to assess some of their manufacturing companies, and the manufacturing companies, all of them could care this much about privacy. That was just not their exposure. Every one of them said it was the business interruption, and most of them didn't have the coverage yet. They were just kind of proactively going through the assessment, but they were clearly worried about their supply chains and things just being down. They've all seen these kind of attacks, and they were able to thwart some of them, but they were looking at the coverage, they just didn't pull the trigger from our vantage point.
So quickly before we open it up to questions, aggregation, we've been talking about it for years. Are you guys actually spending money on aggregated claims? Talk to us about that.
I mean, obviously that's the biggest fear of any insurance company. It's insurance Armageddon, should you have something like that. Has it manifested itself in Armageddon? No. One example would be, let's just say, the Anthem breach. So perhaps your insurer's covering, 50 policies that could be impacted by the Anthem breach. So in that case, Anthem has, certain responsibilities in terms of notification, and then they have to, take care of, do right by the regulators, their customers, et cetera. But then Anthem has contracts with, let's say, 50 or 60 or 70 other entities. Now, those entities have indemnity agreements with Anthem whereby Anthem is going to take care of the lion's share of the costs. Nonetheless, the smaller company can't say, well, Anthem's going to take care of it, I'll just put my hands up and do nothing. So they still do have some responsibilities. So in a situation where an insurer is covering Anthem and 60 others, essentially the costs are low for the other companies, and the self-insured retention pretty much would eat it up. So the other companies might have $10,000, $15,000 worth of expenses in terms of retaining an attorney, overseeing, et cetera. But because of the fact that Anthem, and obviously there's tons of examples, I'm just using that one, Anthem has at the end of the day has the responsibility to take care of the notification, call center, et cetera. We have not seen this, aggregation Armageddon to date.
Yeah, I'll disagree a little bit. I mean, so, Anthem's the business associate in that case, right? And the others are the covered entities. The covered entity has the responsibility to notify. That is the way the High-Tech Act, is written. So the difference is, the reality is how it's been playing out is that the service provider that has the breach has actually stepped up.
Right.
And that's been the surprise. That's the concern has been that they wouldn't, because contractually they're not obligated. NoMoreClipboard.com is another one. It's a cloud provider in the healthcare industry. They had hundreds of businesses that were affected by their breach, so it was an actual cloud breach of PHI. Again, they stepped up contractually. They had no obligation to notify, but they decided to do that and manage the notification. Now, they do that, but to Jeremy's point, the covered entities, a lot of them still want to be involved because they want to manage the response to their consumers, their patients. So I think the reality of the examples that we've seen to date have demonstrated it is not as concerning as we might have thought. But I think there's a lot of examples of just change a few facts here or there. Yeah. If it's social security numbers, if it's, there's a lot of examples of different types of aggregation type of breaches that could have occurred, that could have gone the other way and been a really big event for the insurance industry.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that if Anthem doesn't make that decision to do it, then that's a whole different story. Either they don't have the resources or they decide not to do it for whatever reason, then all those costs blow out to all of you guys, as opposed to a little bit of due diligence costs that some of your clients teed up. So with that, we're going to open up to questions. You don't get too many shots at these guys, so where do we go?
There's some over there, Jim.
John? Come on, John, step to the mic. Come on. You're pretty loud.
Question about the Internet of Things. We're hearing a lot of reports about cars being
I'm happy to start if you want. So from the Verizon side, on the investigative side, we've done a tremendous amount of research, particularly as it relates to things like infrastructure, industrial control systems, the automobile industry, airline industry, all of those kinds of aspects, just because so much more now has embedded technology and so much more of that technology is now internet accessible, right? Most people probably don't realize that, you know, if you buy a car today, your car can be remotely accessed via the internet, via wireless. Most vehicles today can. So what I would say is that there is definitely a real threat of issues out there. We've tested it and we've done work in kind of like an ideal laboratory type setting, and you can see what those exposures look like, and obviously they're not pretty. But the fact of the matter is right now, most of that is still more in a proof of concept stage and in more of a lab setting. I expect that over the course of probably the next 3 to 5 years, we'll start to see things change. But at the same time, we're also already seeing a lot of those vendors, the automakers and so on, that are already starting to kind of foreshadow what that would look like. And obviously it would be bad for business if something happened, right? So they're already starting to take some initiative in trying to figure out how that's going to be properly secured so that we don't have physical issues, right? Because right now, most of what we see from a breach standpoint is a theft of data, which concerns all of us. But when it starts stemming into kind of the kinetic world of it causes car accidents or train accidents, that changes things a lot.
I do think if you look at it from a litigation perspective and an insurer's perspective and a risk management perspective, this is something that down the road could be a real mess. If you go back into the history of cyber insurance, it was pretty much before it existed. It was how can we get the GL to cover it, and then there's obviously been litigation in terms of what the GL should cover vis-a-vis the cyber should cover, et cetera. But if you want to look at the Internet of Things, again, we're going to have this whole thing all over again. So you have a car that gets hacked, so you have a data breach here, but now the car has an accident and you have bodily injury and property damage. And the cyber policies do not cover property damage and bodily injury. So how this is going to play out in terms of coverage and the courts, I don't know. And I don't think this is something that's going to be going away. More and more devices are on the internet. You'll see your friends say, oh, look, here's my house. There's my nanny cam on here. Well, that can be hacked into, and now your house is broken into, and someone gets injured or property gets stolen. Well, does your cyber policy respond to that? Does your CGL policy respond to that? We don't know. The courts don't know. And I think that's something down the road that brokers and insurers are going to have to give some thought to.
Yeah, I think we've looked at that, and I think one of the areas that, when you think about it in a practical sense, that might have the greatest level of vulnerability is in the healthcare space, right? So there's a lot of medical devices that are connected to the internet. So if you write their HML and you write their cyber and maybe even write their DNO, query whether you've really just tripled your exposure on a situation if someone was to get into a hospital's network and shut off a certain type of machinery that might be keeping a number of individuals alive. And the car one is an interesting one. It's obviously scary to think about as a driver, but if you're talking about a single car on a road, right, there's a contained situation there, and I think the question is whether you can think up scenarios where that gets out into a larger sphere, right? So it's not a single car on a single road crashing into a tree, or maybe another car versus something that's more widespread. And so when we've looked at that, we've looked at it in the healthcare space and the interconnectivity of a lot of the healthcare devices that are attached to the internet.
Yeah, John gave my title earlier, which was made up, not really a real title. But the reality is as the head of cyber globally, anything that happens within our organization as a cyber peril, I get consulted on. It doesn't matter whether it's a standalone cover, whether it's casualty, it's property, it's auto, agriculture. I mean, you name it, I've been brought in. And the reality is that we're navigating through this. I mean, insurance has navigated through perils before. So this is a process that we're going to go through, and I think I think Jeremy's right. It's not going to go away, but the insurance industry has to adjust to these exposures and understand what it is that we're getting into. So I think the other lines of coverage are now going to be underwriting to things like cyber perils, whether it's auto coverage, whether on a personal lines basis, or auto manufacturers. In the energy sector, you're already seeing that cyber is completely excluded from property and casualty. So it's created a gap in coverage for that industry. So now the cyber industry is being asked to actually pick that piece up from a cyber standpoint. We will need to see that. I think the reality is, to go back to the aggregation question, I think we will continue down this path as an industry where bodily injury and property will likely be maintained in those lines of coverage until we have that bad day event. And when that bad day event occurs, the insurance industry is going to have to do a real honest test of itself to say, okay, does that capacity all need to go into a standalone cyber offering, or does it continue to stay in other lines of coverage? And I don't know how many large clients are in this room, but think about the tower that you buy, the insurance tower you buy for property or for casualty compared to your cyber tower. Is that going to be enough to protect your organization?
One more question before we get the high sign.
So I'm Jeff Stutzman. I'm not an insurance guy. I'm a cyber threat intelligence guy. And one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of lately are data integrity breaches. They're changing documentation on the fly to manipulate markets, to do all kinds of things. And so what's the thinking on that from the not Verizon piece of the panel? Nothing personal.
Anybody? I mean, I'll take a stab at it. Bottom line is, if someone's in there messing with documents and changing, there's a lot of legal implications to that. You may or may not have a breach in terms of notification, but that's where you bring in the Verizons and the other forensic guys, because you have to figure that out. So much like there might be a BI loss, there might be some other issues, but the real, from my perspective, the trigger is you have intrusion into the system, and that's an issue. Sarah, we weren't going to have any more, but go ahead.
Such a broker question.
Such a broker.
It's funny. I had a question about Mark's report. In his report, there were a couple of incidents reported, and I can't remember the specific industries, but one took 330 hours to recover, and the other one took 5 weeks. I don't know how that happens. I mean, I would be interested to hear Chris's comments on how a company could take that long to actually recover, and there has to have been such a significant incident. But Sarah, to your question, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we're looking at it realistically as far as what we are willing to take as an industry on any one of these losses. So we want a reasonable waiting period, just like we have a deductible. It's really no different. Why it's 12 versus 6 or 24 or 48, I think it depends on the organization, what they do, and everything else. I think it'll potentially get there. But no waiting period is like having no retention, and the insurance industry just doesn't like that too much.
And we've paid those claims. I mean, just because there isn't a large number of them
Right.
doesn't mean that they haven't been paid. They've been paid. We've paid them in excess of 7 figures. So, they are real claims and they do get paid. It's just that the frequency or volume of them is, I think, a lot less than people imagine from the scenarios that they play out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we were saying before, essentially. I mean, on every breach, the forensics is involved, the attorney is involved. I mean, you don't always have business interruption, but no doubt that they are being paid.
And actually, even within that waiting period, we're paying for the forensics, you're paying for some of the other expenses, because it triggers other coverages, not just that. So, you're right, it's paying, but it's just not frequent.
Hey, nice try, though, Sarah. We're done. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the panel. So we're running a little behind, but we're going to catch up.